Good afternoon, everyone. No, go ahead. Okay. So I will the panelists, and then we'll have them come up after the introductions and take a seat. Okay. So this panel is titled, Art History in the Archives, and Art History in the Archives is presenting new archival research featuring art historical artifacts and primary sources, for example, artist papers, letters, sketchbooks, etc. The panel will also provide a platform for revisionist interpretations or reconsideration of a prominent artwork or artist, from scholarship anchored in archival exploration. And so this afternoon's panel includes James Smalls. James Smalls is a professor of visual arts and museum studies, affiliate professor of Africana Studies and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. His research and publications concern the intersectionality of race, gender, and queer sexuality in art and visual culture of 19th century European art and art of the Black diaspora. He's the author of Homosexuality in Art, 2002, and it was reprinted in 2008. The Homoerotic Photography of Coleman Vecton, Public Face, Private Thoughts, 2006. He's recently published Sculpting African Nouveau, Primitivism, Ethnography, and Afro-Kitsch in the works of Woodrow Nash, an International Review of African American Art. He is currently finishing up a book manuscript titled Farrell Benga, African Muse of Modernism. Then we have Kirsten Pye Buick. Kirsten Pye Buick, PhD. She's a professor of art history at the University of New Mexico, where she's worked since 2001. She's the author of Child of the Fire, Marriott Monia Lewis, and The Problem of Art History's Black and Indian Subject, Duke University Press, 2010, as well as numerous articles on African American art. Her research and teaching interests include the visual and material culture of the first British Empire, American landscapes, U.S. art from the colonial period to World War II, African American art, and women as patrons and collectors of art. In 2015, she was the recipient of the David C. Driscoll Prize for her contributions to the field of African American and art and art history. Her forthcoming book, In Authenticity, Carol Walker and the Eidetics of Racism, is in progress. And our final presenter is Dr. David Driscoll. David C. Driscoll is an active artist whose work as a painter and printmaker has been exhibited globally. He is well known as a leading authority on African American art, having authored 5 books on the subject and published more than 50 catalogs on the work of African American artists. He received the Presidential Medal from President William Jefferson Clinton in the Humanities in 2000. The David C. Driscoll Center for the Study of the African Diaspora was established in his honor at the University of Maryland at College Park in 2001. He is a trustee of the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, there is an annual $25,000 prize in his name that is offered annually. For this presentation, he has said, quote, over a period of one half century, I have chronicled many of the activities relating to my travel and art research to Africa, Asia, Europe, Central and South America. Drawings and sketches accompany descriptive writings in the form of visual diaries. I will be presenting a brief sampling of these works, noting that scholars in the discipline of art history have used these materials as primary sources in their research in art from time to time. Dr. Driscoll is the recipient of 13 honorary doctoral degrees, and he and his wife Thelma reside in Hyattsville, Maryland, Falmouth, Maine, and New York City. So please give the 3 panelists a round of applause, and I ask them to come forward. Thank you. You can tell I'm substituting, so we're going to do one at a time. So we'll have James Smalls come up first. Thank you.
Hello. Don't know if I have my slides up or not. Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you. So the very first sentence in my book that I wrote in 2006 on Carl Van Vechten, who, by the way, continues to be one of the most, if not the most, reviled, self-proclaimed white connoisseurs of black life, art, and culture, and justifiably so. Anyway, in that book, I wrote this. I said, quote, "The most intriguing and ultimately rewarding research is sometimes sparked by gossip and hearsay." Now, although I wrote those words a little over a decade ago, they couldn't be more true today as they were then. In preparing for this colloquium, I thought about actually the relationship between gossip, hearsay, anecdote, and innuendo, hence the title of my talk, a blank screen. So the title of my talk is Gossip, Hearsay, Anecdote, Innuendo, Playing in and with the Archives. In preparing for this colloquium, I thought about the relationship of those things in relationship to my own pleasures as well as frustrations in conducting research on black diasporic topics. And it's been argued, and I believe there is some validity in this, that in gossip one can find a radical model of postmodern knowledge which could serve well in the reading and in the rewriting of racial, gendered, and sexual historical narratives, which my research is very interested in. So archives, thinking about this, can have alternative possibilities of exploring, defining, distributing past and present knowledge, and one possibility is considering the voices of the oppressed or the subaltern, oftentimes called the history from below approach, which considers utilizing ignored materials within existing collections and recording ignored voices through, for example, oral history projects. So by considering and incorporating these voices that are typically written out of mainstream art history, traditional notions of knowledge and history in the United States and elsewhere are subverted. However, there still remain challenges, of course, in discovering and contextualizing archival material on black diasporic art and artists, and a rethinking of the uses of archives could open up a number of exciting possibilities. Thank you. So archives can be used for salvage and rescue operations by using aspects of them to build and encode all kinds of narratives, as well as responsibly speculative and creative accounts that confront, intervene in, that disrupt and or derail standard forms of inquiry. And so with this lost and found approach to art history, we are invited to confront the archives as a source for subversive readings, so to reconstruct lost lives and lost deeds. So such an approach allows for us not only to include those who have traditionally been excluded, but also to ascertain the general exclusionary strategies of mainstream archives. So in this process then of me rethinking the archives, there are some questions that I thought to ponder regarding the meaning and role of archives in African American art history, such as what is the role of archives in the formation as well as in the deformation and reformation of black consciousness and our social and political integration into American democracy and citizenship? In what ways can archives be used as a weapon or as a strategic sort of roadmap in the struggle for racial equality and for inclusion? So when we think about archives, we also have to consider the very nature of materials, including as well, of course, text and as well as images, but also things like postcards and films and ephemera and audio sources. So for my own work, interestingly, eBay, Tumblr, and Pinterest actually have become invaluable archival sources for me, for my work. And I'll show you some images in a second in terms of what I'm working on so you understand what I'm talking about. We might also entertain the idea of imaginary, and I actually don't like that word, I prefer speculative archives produced by artists and critics past and present, especially when archives are inaccessible, that is hidden away in private collections, or non-existent, when you don't have any archives at all. So We should not be afraid to venture beyond official archives where we might locate and exploit the possibilities of constructing the elusive archive of, for example, traces or ephemera, of innuendo, gesture, gossip, hearsay, anecdote, those kind of things that I titled my talk here today. What has also been called silly archives, or we've heard this morning, an archive of feelings as well. So archives speak to how we interpret the past and the present, so to affect the future. And in this respect, I think that these speculative approaches to archives, which I actually enjoy a lot, can be important to African American and Black diasporic art history and identity formation and preservation. So archives, particularly of the speculative sort, serve as antidotes against forgetting. So perhaps in the context of African American art, we have to accept such approaches as one way of writing ourselves back into history and art history. So creative or speculative archives raise questions about what counts, of course, as knowledge and what are appropriate objects of studies in specific disciplines. So in my own research, that often involves piecing together archival fragments whenever I can find them, and then critically, and when I say that I mean responsibly, as well as creatively speculating on their connection. So it's not off-the-wall speculation, it's an informed kind of speculation. So you speculate on their connections, their strengths, their weaknesses as well. However, recognizing that archival fragments can be distorted or exaggerated or misleading or outright false sometimes is important. It's important to always keep in mind and question, or at least remain skeptical of archives as sources of information, sources of truth with a capital T, right, which we tend to do a lot of times. So archives are not neutral, they're not innocent. Someone decided what was worth counting or what was worth keeping and how to count and keep it most of the time. But nevertheless, a certain amount of romanticism also remains about archives, that in them lingers some kind of assurance of concreteness or some sort of objectivity or recovery, or some idea that these archives are going to make us whole again somehow, that we're going to get all of that past history and become whole. So we passionately cling to archives despite their faults in the hopes of somehow connecting to a past that we can never fully know. So this archival romanticism, or as Jacques Derrida, a well-known French philosopher, called it, archive fever, that seems, in my view, this kind of romanticism plague much of the work done around, for example, the art and artists of the Harlem Renaissance, and there's no harm in romanticizing, but I think we need to understand when we're doing that and why we're doing that as well. So when no concrete or institutional archives exist for a particular subject, one can assemble one from an against-the-grain reading of a wide range of sources. And this reading against the grain has become perhaps the key methodological strategy for other kinds of art histories and histories: queer art history, women's art and art history, other histories of marginalization. Now, in my own work, I've found that there is a very interesting interplay between subjective investigation into lived experience while documenting the context in which that experience transpired. So I'm interested in my own research in what we call ephemera, that is, those ephemeral notes and objects and images and traces and debris and fleeting performances. My current research, for example, on this guy, he was a Senegalese dancer and artist model whose name was Farrell Benga, who was actually born Francois Benga in 1906, is vested in the idea of remembering and preserving at least the visual memories of this particular Black life, but also other Black lives, Black efforts, Black contributions, Black forms of memorialization, and Black forms of self-representation, vested in those ephemeral materials and in ephemeral performances. So let me tell you a little bit very quickly about this guy. Farrell Benga, in 1923, when he was 17 years old, Francois Benga left his native Dakar in Senegal, traveled to Paris with his father, who he had a very rocky relationship with. And it was while on that trip that he decided to run away. He worked odd jobs to make ends meet. Then in 1925, a very important year generally, this was the same year that Josephine Baker appeared in La Revue Nègre. During that year, Benga learned that the Folies Bergère, this is the music hall in Paris, was on the lookout for black dancers. He auditioned for that and he was hired. He then, at that point, adopted his stage name, Feral, which in French, it means feral, which means wild or untamed. And of course, that has a particular significance. And within a few years became one of the star attractions of the Parisian music hall scene. He was known for his physical dexterity, his very good looks, his very sensual dancing, and also sensual choreography. He gained a popular reputation in Paris as the male counterpart to Josephine Baker, with whom he became, by the way, very good friends, very close friends, danced with periodically at various entertainment venues throughout Paris. Here, Josephine Baker in her playing Fatou in the 1926 La Folie du Jour. Benga is there at the far right, at the lower left, squatting. He's one of the African drummers that accompanied her. And then, just in fact, a couple of weeks ago, just browsing through the internet, I came across this photo here, and I was very surprised to come across it, of Josephine Baker, and there is Feral Benga standing there at her right. So they became very, very good friends and very important people who performed together. And so here's two postcards. And a lot of these images that I'm showing you come from eBay, and they have a long story about that. And then others come from certain archives. Anyway, from the 20s into the 30s, Benga appeared in many, many on-stage revues and tableaux, some of which exploited primitivism and exoticism. I'm just comparing him, and by the way, the postcards there on the right come from eBay. But this particular image here, on the lip of the negress, is one of those elements of exoticism and primitivism that he performed in. And so in doing this research, what's interesting is that I realized that I have to consider Benga, Josephine Baker, other black artists and performers of the period in the problematic context of primitivism and modernism, and to discern their agency in these things as opposed to their assumed victimization. And so that's one of the elements here that I envision. My time is up, but I'm going to just go through quickly through the images so you see what I'm talking about. Feral Benga modeled himself after Josephine Baker's career. In fact, he became Josephine Baker in a lot of his performances, dressing in Josephine Baker drag. So in both of these instances here, this is Feral Benga in Josephine Baker drag as a kind of homage to her, but also showing his own talents as a very well known and very talented dancer and performer as well. Oops. These are elements that indicate, these are sources where there's some anecdotal information about Feral Benga's life and his reputation. I can't go into them right now. Gorer was one of those English anthropologists who accompanied Feral Benga on a trip throughout Africa, and there they are. These all come from eBay. These are from music hall magazines, for example, showing him in terms of his performances. And there are certain dynamics that I've discovered with these images in terms of his performances. You see here, just want to hurry up and get through them. Then, of course, Richmond Barthé, an African-American sculptor, sculpted Feral Benga. And then he actually went to Paris and saw him perform. And here I'm showing you Feral Benga, who owned a restaurant, of which Barthé went and saw him perform there, here on the left. Anyway, there's a lot more of these images. I think I'm going to stop here. Most of them coming out of eBay, but giving us a very interesting indication of Feral Benga and his career. So just in terms of how I amass these archives and have to create a narrative, because there's no one place where there are archives on this particular person who has been lost to history and to modernism. And so I have to construct it based on what I find. And so this is an example of that. Thank you very much for your attention.